Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Phil Dougherty. I'm a senior product manager here at DigitalOcean, focused on Kubernetes, our container registry, as well as deployment platform products. I'm really happy to have you all here today, so we can talk a little bit about DigitalOcean Kubernetes, which is our managed Kubernetes offering. So what are we going to discuss today? Well, firstly, we're going to talk about our journey for building the DOKS product, why we decided to build it, and kind of what our goals were going into it. And then we're going to touch on DOKS as it stands today, some of the different features that are available in the product, how you can leverage them, and what some of the best practices are for taking advantage of DOKS. After that, we're going to talk a bit about how we actually leverage DOKS internally to build other products and what we're doing with DOKS going forward after that. And then we will open it up to some Q&A. So this webinar is going to be recorded, and the video will be shared with you via email, and it will also be posted on our DigitalOcean YouTube channel and on the DigitalOcean community site, so you can find it there after we wrap up. And if you have any questions, please type them in the question box below, and we'll answer as many as we can live and at the end of the talk. And if we don't get to your question, we'll answer it in the next week or two on our do.co/techtalks site, and you'll get a link to that via email. So let's jump right into it. So I wanted to start out with a quote here. This is a quote from the CEO of one of our customers that's running on DOKS. This is a gaming company. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this to you. So DigitalOcean's focus on simple features that just work and high value pricing at scale has resulted in an effortless deployment of Kubernetes. The product has been absolutely instrumental for my team in simplifying our technology stack and focusing on our business. So I think this quote really sums up a lot of our goals when we set out to build DOKS. We wanted to make something that was simple for our end users and help them to get their software deployed, make it simple for them to manage the lifecycle of their application and clusters, and make it easier to get their technology stack released so they can focus more time on their business and their application. So why did we decide to do that? Well, because Kubernetes is hard. It can be challenging to wrap your head around a lot of the various concepts, and there's a whole lot that Kubernetes is capable of doing. In a lot of cases, you may not need all of that functionality, and it's a subset of that will be more than sufficient for your needs. And we try to take a lot of those difficult concepts and break them down into a more simple interface where you can get done what you need to get done quickly. So what were our goals as we started out on this project? So we wanted to make it simple for users to go from zero, so knowing nothing about Kubernetes, to having a running cluster in the easiest way possible. And then we wanted to make it so that once you had that cluster running, you could get your applications deployed as quickly as possible. And on top of that, once you have your applications deployed, we wanted to make it possible to remove the hassle of management and maintenance. So things like upgrades, security patches, scaling, for example. Those are all things that if you're going to run Kubernetes on your own can become quite a challenge, especially the upgrade process. On top of that, we wanted to give users an experience they love with pricing that they understand and are comfortable with. So one of our, the tenets of DigitalOcean is we want to build awesome user experiences. So we brought that same goal to the table when we were building DOKS. And then we wanted to provide actionable insights so that users could make good choices about how to manage their setup. So things like, how is my cluster performing? Are my applications available? Et cetera. So all of that stuff is baked directly into the product, so you don't have to go and add that on top later down the line. And we wanted to make it really easy to scale whenever users needed to. So if your needs change and you have some, a new type of workload that you need to deploy, we want to make it possible for you to do that without having to make drastic changes or to launch a complete new cluster, et cetera. So we'll touch on some of that in a later section here. And then really importantly, we wanted to make sure that we conform to all the Cloud Native Computing Foundation standards. That way, if you're already using Kubernetes somewhere else on maybe a different cloud provider, or you're running it on premise, for example, you can ensure that your workloads are going to function properly in exactly the same way with DOKS. So let's jump into a quick overview of DOKS. So like I mentioned, we really wanted to keep things simple. So if you've ever launched a droplet with DigitalOcean, this screen should look kind of familiar to you. So launching a cluster happens all within this one screen. So there's not a ton of different submenus you need to jump into, and we lay it out in a way that I think is really clean and nice. So the first thing you're gonna need to do is select the Kubernetes version that you want to deploy. So we always maintain a rolling set of the most 3 recent minor versions. So the minor versions are, for example, 1.16, 1.17, 1.15. And we release those as soon as they've passed all of our end-to-end tests. So you can expect those to come out, within a month of release, for example. So in this case, you can see that I selected a 1.16.2 version. And you don't need to worry too much about that do.0 there, but what that is we will periodically make patch level updates that are maybe specific to DigitalOcean Kubernetes that aren't specific to Kubernetes itself. And if you have automatic upgrades enabled, you'll be able to get those. And what those do is provide new features, for example, that are separate from the patch level version of Kubernetes, which is the the .2 in this case. After that, you need to select a region or data center where your Kubernetes cluster is going to run. So a Kubernetes cluster today cannot span data centers or regions. So in this case, I have selected San Francisco too. But if I had, a large user base in India, for example, maybe I'd like to select Bangalore instead. So once I've done that, I'm presented with the VPC network with which I want my cluster to reside. So VPC is, well, our newest version of VPC is fairly new to DigitalOcean. In this case, I have a default VPC network. But if I go to my manage section of the cloud UI, I can create a new VPC specifically for this cluster or for a specific project. And what that will do is create a private network with which all my different components and services that live in that network can communicate. But anything outside of that cannot. And I'm able to specify a certain IP range that I want for the internal network, et cetera. So that's really handy. After that, I need to configure my cluster capacity. So we have a concept of node pools within DOKS. So what you can do is you can have just one node pool, for example. So you can see here I have a node pool, the first one, which is made up of our standard node type. And those are, I chose the $20 a month node, and I want to run 3 of those. And that would just be just fine. If that's all I needed, great. Let's say I had an additional workload that I wanted to deploy to this cluster that needed a specific type of node. So say I had something that's really CPU intensive. In this case, I went ahead and added an additional node pool and selected the $40 a month CPU optimized plan, and I want to run 5 of those. In addition to CPU optimized and standard, we also have general purpose nodes, which have an even distribution between CPUs and memory. And we also have memory optimized nodes, which have a higher amount of memory. So it really depends on the workload that you're running when it comes to setting up your node pools. And that's going to depend totally on your application. So the reason this is important is because maybe if you were to choose CPU optimized, but you had a really memory intensive workload, then you would end up wasting a lot of CPU that you're paying for that isn't being utilized. So it's important to understand kind of how your application functions, what its resource needs are, so that you can properly select the right instance type in this case. And you can add as many of these as you want. So if you decided later that you needed to add another one, that's no problem. You can go right ahead and add one through the settings, which I can show you here in a bit. So once you've selected your node pools, and by the way, this is all one screen, I just took screenshots of it. We give you an estimate of what your monthly payment is going to come out to. So this is just for the cluster. And so there's no cost for DOKS, which is another huge benefit that I should have touched on. So a lot of other cloud providers that you go to, you're going to pay a base price just to run the control plane that powers the cluster. And then on top of that, you're going to pay for the different servers that make up your node pools or the nodes that are powering the cluster. And in the case of DOKS, we're giving you the control plane for free. So that's fairly unheard of in the market. So we're really proud of that. And it's made it so that a lot of people want to come to us to learn and just make it really simple and cost effective to get started. So in this case, the $260 a month that I'm showing is just the amount for those node pools that I've created. If in addition down the line, I add a load balancer, for example, or I attach block storage, that's not reflected here. But those are the two other components of the DOKS cluster that could result in some cost on your invoice at the end of the month. So after that, I can add tags. So I added a few example tags here. So tags, if you're not familiar within DigitalOcean, are used to basically correlate different things within the platform together. So if I could tag a load balancer, I could tag a droplet, I could tag a cluster, for example, with a project name or something along those lines, and be able to look at those all in one place. So those can be handy if you're already using tags. After that, you need to give the cluster a name. So in this case, I set it to my test cluster. We actually pre-populate this with a default name for you. So if if it doesn't matter what it's called to you, then you can go ahead and leave it. But otherwise, feel free to edit it and set the name that's appropriate for this cluster. And then finally, you have the option to select a project. So projects within DigitalOcean are another way to organize your various components and assets into a single place where you can manage them as a group. Once you've set all that, you can go ahead and create cluster. And then just a couple of minutes later, you'll be presented with your cluster overview. So on this screen, there's a couple of things we need to break down here. So we can see our total cluster capacity here, right on the top of the overview. This is really great because when you're using Kubernetes, you can stop thinking about your individual nodes. So I don't know if you've heard the phrase, treat them as cattle, not pets. So if a server dies, another one will come online to replace it. So you can start thinking about your cluster in terms of its total capacity. So out of those nodes that I selected, I have 12 CPUs available, 36 gigabytes of memory, and 315 gigabytes of onboard disk. And then, like we showed before, the total cluster cost, that'll give you a quick preview. The reason that's different is because I think I actually took this screenshot from a different cluster that I had launched, but no bother. That would be 260 if we had, if the node pools were the same configuration that I had selected in the previous screen. And then we could see the VPC network that we selected, and then the available upgrades down below. So if my cluster was out of date and needed an upgrade, I would be presented, with a call to action there to go ahead and update my cluster, and that would kick that off for me automatically. And on the right side, I'm able to download my kube config file. So your kube config is what you're going to use to configure your kube control, your command line interface for interacting with the cluster from the CLI. So you can really easily download it there. And we can see our tags that we have been set, and then some various resources that we have available for getting started with Kubernetes, how to interact with our product. So this is a view of the insights screen. So we have, by default, we'll give you CPU usage, load average, memory usage, and you can split that over various time periods. Right here, I'm showing 6 hours, but you can go down to the minute. And then additionally, we're showing cluster-wide here, but with the drop down at the top there, I can actually select an individual node pool. So if I wanted to see CPU across my CPU optimized node pool, I could do that. And I can also break it down to the individual node, which is really handy for kind of picking out if there's an outlier, if there's an issue with a specific node that you're having, you'll be able to detect it here within the Insights tab. We also have an advanced metrics solution that you can install, and what that will do is expose more Kubernetes specific metrics into this interface. So things like number of pods, number of workloads, things of that nature. And you can also set alert policies on all of these things. And our alert policies will let you either send to an email address, or you can configure it to post directly into Slack. So you can get up-to-date alerts if things are having problems within your cluster. So this screen is what the node pool kind of node management screen looks like. So I'm able to see my node pool, when each of those nodes came online, and I can take action on individual nodes or on the node pool as a whole. So you can see for the node pool, I'm able to either resize it or enable auto scaling. I can edit the tags. I can also delete it. On an individual node, I can either recycle it or I can destroy it. So in the case of recycling it, what that's going to do is take down that node and replace it with a new one. So you might want to do that in the case where you know you're having a specific problem with that one node and you want a new one to come online. In the case of delete, excuse me, in the case of delete, it's the equivalent of, okay, remove this node and scale down by 1, so it won't replace it. So it's handy in a couple of different scenarios there. And then, as you can see, I can either have auto scaling enabled there or resize my cluster. So if I choose to, if I go to that screen, I have a couple of options. So I can choose a fixed size. So say I wanted 8 nodes, I can go ahead and just click that up to 8 nodes. It'll show me what my monthly run rate's going to increase to and hit save. In this case, I selected auto scale. So what I'm able to do is set a minimum number of nodes and a maximum number of nodes. So what this will do is, if I'm using horizontal plot auto scaling, which is already enabled, as well as vertical plot auto scaling on DOKS in my manifest, then as Kubernetes is unable to schedule pods on my cluster, it'll automatically add a new node. And as I don't need that capacity anymore because utilization, my traffic has gone down, then we'll automatically remove the nodes. So that's really handy for, firstly, making sure that your users have a great experience and you always have enough capacity online to handle that. But in addition to that, you don't always have so much capacity that you're spending money that you don't need to be spending. So we highly recommend enabling auto scaling if it makes sense for your workload. And then finally here, let's take a look at the settings screen. So in the settings, we have just a couple of options, but the upgrade window one is pretty important. So right now I have automatic upgrades enabled, and you can also set basically a maintenance window. So if by enabling automatic upgrades, we'll only upgrade patch level stuff. So if you're going from 1.16.1 to 1.16.2, we'll do that during your maintenance window. So the maintenance window can either be any day of the week and a time period, so it's a 3-hour window, or you can set up a specific day of the week that you want upgrades to happen, and we'll ensure that they always happen during that window. That's handy if you want to be around when the upgrade's happening in case of some unforeseen issue. But the way we do the upgrades is, we bring up a node, take down a node. So you're never going to have less capacity. And so far, upgrades have gone great and have been working really well for our users. In the case of a minor version upgrade, where I'm going from 1.16 to 1.17, we do notify you that an upgrade's available, but you need to come in and click the upgrade button because there are more things that change in between minor version upgrades. In certain cases, there could be deprecation of certain features, etc. So we want to make sure that users are aware of those and are around during that upgrade. And then lastly, you can destroy your cluster. So you can go ahead and take it down. And then we have a full integration with our command line tool, DO control. So one thing that's handy is you can easily switch between your Kubernetes clusters and save them to your kubeconfig by using the top command there, that do control Kubernetes cluster kubeconfig save. You just give it the name. So, mine could have been my test cluster there, and it'll automatically switch my context for kubeconfig. You're able to list your clusters. You're able to list the node pools within your clusters. You can basically do anything through the CLI that you can do through the UI. So, as a developer, you're probably prefer being in the command line interface. So we're not leaving you hanging there. There's full integration via the CLI with the platform. And then we have really, really great community content. This is something that DigitalOcean as a whole is great at, and I think we're all really proud of, is the amount of tutorials and content that we have for helping you to get started. So there's a ton of stuff in the community around Kubernetes. Everything from beginner level content up to expert level content. So it's a really wonderful place to go ask questions, get answers from our team, interact with other developers that are learning or using Kubernetes, and just kind of get involved in the community. And one thing that I really wanted to point out was this Kubernetes for full stack developers curriculum that we've created. So this is really fantastic. So this is a step-by-step guide to help you to get your feet wet and get up and running with Kubernetes. So this isn't really DOKS specific. This is just Kubernetes general content. So I definitely recommend taking a look at this and giving this a go. So I linked down below the link to the PDF there. Okay, so how do we use Kubernetes and DOKS internally? So all services that run at DigitalOcean run on Kubernetes. So we've been using Kubernetes for quite a long time, 5 years or so now. Currently, the system is not DOKS. It was developed prior to DOKS. And we have kind of developed a PaaS-like interface for our development teams to interact with on top of Kubernetes, and it's worked out really, really great for us. We do automated tests and builds, and for every pull request that gets merged, every commit, and we have a dedicated staging environment that all of our developers interact with. For all of our production deployments, we do canary deployments and also A/B testing of new features that are going out. Everything that we deploy is capable of having a multi-region deployment, which is really great. It's important for us as a service provider to make sure that we have high availability so that we can then provide highly available solutions to you as our end users. And what we did was we took the best practices from our internal deployments and our experience using Kubernetes, and we used that to, start the design for when we were beginning to develop DOKS. And interesting little tidbit is that the initial DOKS team was actually the same team who had developed the internal platform. So we took a lot of those best practices and experience and brought it to the table when building DOKS. But since we've developed DOKS, a lot of our newer products are actually using it under the hood. So our marketplace, not sure if you've checked that out or not, but it's really great. We have hundreds of tools that traditionally were, one-click deploy to a droplet to one of our virtual machines. Since then, we've added Kubernetes-specific marketplace items. So if you want to get a full-fledged logging and monitoring stack, you can do that with one click and deploy it to your Kubernetes cluster. You'll end up with Grafana and a whole bunch of other goodies. And we're doing a globally geo-load balanced solution with that, so users are always getting the fastest experience. And I linked here a blog that's really interesting. It's a few parts, but it gets into detail and in depth about how the marketplace team utilized DOKS to deliver this product. So definitely recommend checking out that blog post. It's really interesting. And then our DigitalOcean container registry is also powered by DOKS. So if you haven't heard of DOCR, it's our registry product. It's kind of in an early access period right now, with a GA coming soon. It's also deployed in multiple regions. And the way it works is that there's a caching system where we're basically storing the images that you push or all around the globe in the closest region nearby to where they were pulled down towards. So if you had a cluster running in Frankfurt, for example, and you pulled something down, we'll cache it there. So you're always going to get fast access to those images. If you, for example, scale up or you need to, you make a new deployment. And then we have new products that are currently being built that leverage DOKS. And I wish I could talk about this, but I can't. But I will just say that you're going to be really excited about what it is. So stay tuned for news on that. And our plans are for future products to also leverage DOKS. So for us, it's become a great building block that's helped us internally to move more quickly and deliver better products to folks like you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the near-term roadmap or where we're headed with the product. So there is a heck of a lot on our roadmap. It's way too large to fit in here. If I went into great detail on it, we could do an entire webinar as long as this, just talking about that. The one thing that's coming soon, like I mentioned, is general availability of our DigitalOcean container registry. And I think that you're all going to be really excited about the feature set that we have for that and the pricing. So definitely competitive. And if you're planning to use DOKS, it's definitely a good idea to try to leverage DOCR so that your images are stored nearby to your clusters. And then another one that we think is going to make a big impact in terms of usability and making it better for you to use the product is we're doing a UX overhaul. So right now it can be kind of painful when you launch your DOKS cluster because the underlying worker nodes will show up in your droplet list, for example. Your block storage devices show up in the list with all your other block storage devices that aren't related to DOKS. And that is not ideal. So we're redesigning things so that everything is kind of, maintained in one place. So it's really easy to see what's related to what else. And there's not, a mix up going on between where you go to manage something related to your cluster. When you want to manage something that's related to your cluster, you go to the cluster. So that's the way it will be before too long. And we're also making some changes in terms of improving our onboarding and new user education. So one screen that I didn't show after your cluster comes online is we kind of walk you through a few steps of getting your first application deployed to the cluster. And while that is useful, we think we can do a lot better and do a better job of helping you to get going. So look forward to some new content and some new interfaces around providing that functionality. And then next, we have something coming soon, which is upgrade release channels. So I talked a bit about the upgrades and how you can enable automatic upgrades for patches, and you have to kind of click the button for minor version upgrades. Soon we'll be enabling something called release channels. So you'll be able to basically say, I want to be on the bleeding edge, I want to be on stable. And that way, if you don't always want to be on the latest version of Kubernetes, you want to ensure that you're on the oldest that we're supporting out of the 3 versions, then you can do that, and we will adjust how often we contact you and how frequently and the notifications that we send you. And also when it comes to the automatic upgrades, we'll only do security patches and things of that nature. And second to last here, we are adding workload management into the UI. So right now, you get your cluster up and running, but all the interaction you do in terms of your applications is all happening through the command line or kind of through the Kubernetes dashboard that we link you out to from the cloud UI. But we think we can do better than that. So making it possible for you to understand what's running on your cluster, how they're performing, how many pods you have running for a certain workload, et cetera. We plan to expose that and tie that into our metrics and alerting. And then this is a pretty big one, multi-master clusters. So right now the control plane is a single node. It is highly available in that all of the etcd data and all of the configuration is stored on a block storage device. So in the event that a master fails, we automatically bring another one online, attach the block storage device, and a minute later you're back in business. But that does mean a minute of API downtime for Kubernetes. So we plan to offer multi-master clusters coming fairly soon. And that's all I had for you today. So thank you so much for joining. And I think we're going to now open it up to Q&A if there are any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bill. To everyone in the audience, if you have any questions, please type them in the questions box now and we'll answer as many as we can live. So first question, how can I move my DOKS cluster to another project?
Okay, yeah, so that's actually one that is has been an open one for a while. So the associated resources stuff I talked about in terms of how we're trying to better associate the components that make up your cluster in the UI also is related to that. So that's one that we are nearly done with, but just has a few kind of like hanging requirements that we have to complete before we can fully ship that. So I'd expect that to before the end of this year be possible. Right now, I know it's a pain point.
Cool. Are the advanced metrics free to activate?
They are, yes. So if you click on that, we basically provide you with a manifest that you apply to your cluster, and then it'll start working.
Can you define an instance of a node and what it can be used for?
Sure, yeah. So a node is just honestly a droplet under the hood. So you can pretty much run anything on it. So if I have, say, for example, I created a Kubernetes cluster in DOKS and I had a node pool of a single node, anything I deployed to my cluster, maybe it's an API, maybe it's a web server, maybe it's some type of service that I've created, will run on that instance, that node. So then the terms are interchangeable.
Great. And we're wondering if these two CLIs work together. DOCTL, does it substitute kubectl?
It doesn't substitute it, but it is, what's the word I'm looking for? It complements it. So you could think of DOCTL as interacting with the cluster itself in terms of like the DOKS cluster. So the node pools, the nodes, its tags, how many nodes are running in a node pool, the version, for example. Whereas kubectl, you're going to be interacting with what's running on the cluster. So your workloads, your applications, and their settings.
Is the master always one node or is it HA? How does it scale when nodes are added and removed from the cluster?
Sure, yeah. So right now it is one node, like I mentioned. It is backed by block storage and can be recovered very quickly, basically in the time it takes for a droplet to come online, which is under a minute. That is one of the features that has been widely requested that we're working on bringing to market soon. We do have vertical auto scaling enabled for the masters. So for example, if you start scaling out your cluster and you add lots and lots of nodes and many node pools, for example, it's going to require more resources on the master in order for things to keep functioning smoothly. And we more or less have a ratio where as things get busy on your cluster, we'll auto scale the master vertically to support that.
Cool. Is there any plan to have one cluster with node pools that span multiple data centers in the same region?
Um, that's definitely something we'd love to do. In our case, in the case of DigitalOcean, we don't really have availability zones per se, so like a shared private network across data centers in a region. So that would be a prerequisite for doing that. We definitely would love to do something like that, and we'd also love to do something just around federation in general, so cross-region clusters. I think that's going to be definitely further down the line, as it's a kind of a company-wide thing, a network-wide thing that we need to tackle.
Does DOKS support external load balancer?
It does, yeah. So if you specify a service of type load balancer in your manifest, it'll automatically launch a DigitalOcean LBAS instance. So yeah, that all works well.
Are you doing anything that resembles an AWS Lambda and Golang?
Um, so maybe maybe down the line. We have some exciting stuff coming soon that's more focused on just application deployment, but nothing that we've announced as of yet.
How do I secure my DigitalOcean Kubernetes cluster?
Sure, yeah. So we set some sane defaults for you using our firewalls. So like I mentioned, the workers are droplets. So we have a default, basically deny all policy set, and we'll automatically open ports for you when you create a load balancer, for example, or you can go in and create a new firewall policy to basically set whatever restrictions that you see fit for your cluster. And all of that information is available in the documentation.
Great, thanks. Does the auto scaling feature require the workload to define things like CPU and memory thresholds to work, or does DOKS automatically recognize when nodes are heavily loaded on its own?
No, you need to configure the horizontal pod auto scaling configuration in your workload. So you need to set that auto scale and the prefer thresholds.
Great. Are the underlying nodes automatically upgraded themselves as well?
Yes. So when an upgrade happens, we'll first upgrade the master, and then once it's back, we'll proceed with upgrading the nodes. So we'll do one node pull at a time. Like I said, we'll bring up a node, bring down a node. There is some work coming soon that around surge upgrades. So we'll allow you to say, like, I want to upgrade 10 nodes at a time. And as long as you have the available capacity in terms of your account limits, then we'll be able to do that. But yeah, it upgrades the entire cluster, so master and the workers.
Great. Are there any support for Windows worker nodes? We have a legacy Windows server code that need to run along with Linux containers.
So not today. It's something that we've considered for sure. I don't think that would land anytime soon, though, unfortunately.
Can you comment on a NoSQL like NoSQL like database like DynamoDB?
Yeah, so we have a set of DBaaS products that we offer today. So Postgres, MySQL, and Redis. The closest thing would be to use there's some NoSQL-like functionality built into Postgres, and I think that in the next couple of quarters we might have an announcement around a NoSQL database that we'll be providing to users. You're welcome to try to run whatever you want on your Kubernetes cluster. Just beware that the storage is ephemeral, right? So Cassandra or something could be a possible option, but in terms of officially supported DigitalOcean product, there's nothing to be announced today, but definitely kind of keep your ears open for a potential announcement in the future.
Great. How do you build or configure multi-region clusters for optimized user experience in terms of geo distribution with local routing or locality routing?
Sure, yeah. So if you read the blog post that I linked to about how the marketplace did it, we're actually leveraging Cloudflare for the edge routing. And then we have ingress nodes, like a node pool that's specific to running ingresses within the cluster. But all the details on how the marketplace team, as well as the DOCR team, accomplish that are in that marketplace blog post. So if you just search for like DigitalOcean marketplace DOKS, you'll find the blog post, and it goes into depth. So it should be pretty helpful for explaining how we did it.
Is it possible to have a zero downtime cluster upgrade for minor versions?
Yeah, so actually all of the upgrades are zero downtime. So that's why we bring up a node first and we drain and core down the node so no new workloads can be placed on it. We bring up a new node, we drain node number one that we want to take down. All of its workloads get moved to the new node, then we take the old node down. And we do that on a step-by-step basis until the cluster has been upgraded. The downside to doing that one by one is that if you have a huge cluster, it can take a long time. That's why we're working on this surge upgrade functionality, which will allow you to upgrade a larger cluster more quickly.
Great. Is there a max size cluster that can be upgraded in a 3-hour window?
I don't know off the top of my head what the max would be in the current 1x1 setup for a 3-hour window. We do have a max cluster size of 512 nodes right now, so would have to be below that. I'm be happy to get back to you on that one though.
Great. How do I figure out how much DOKS is going to cost me?
Sure. So the service in general costs nothing, so it's free of charge. You only pay for the underlying resources that you use. So if you look at the cost of our droplets and the cost of our load balancer and block storage, it's going to be basically the combined cost of whatever you're using. So we do provide, like I showed in the cluster create and the overview, a general idea of what if you're not scaling, your cluster would cost that month just for the workers, the droplets. And then in addition to that, you'd pay additional costs for the load balancers or for the block storage. So load balancers are $10 per month. And then block storage depends on the size of the volume.
Great. Can I use the metrics to set up auto scaling rules?
Not today, unfortunately. So That's something that definitely we've thought about. Right now, the auto scaling is just based on whether or not Kubernetes is able to schedule new pods or not.
How long did you and your team research and start this DOKS project?
Um, so it actually was sort of started before I joined the company. I've been here for about 2 years, and they had been working on it for, oh, 6 months or so, maybe before that. So I joined before we had our kind of early access beta program. So 6 to 9 months, but it's something that we're always learning, and we learn the most from our users. So it's an iterative process for sure.
Very cool. What's your best advice when it comes to persistent storage for services running on nodes?
Sure, yeah. So um, we have block storage integration directly built into the product via our container storage interface. So if you look in our documentation, or you look up DigitalOcean-CSI within GitHub, you'll see a bit more information about how that works. But more or less, you can define a persistent volume, and then one of your workloads can define a persistent volume claim, where it is basically mounts and makes use of that block storage device. And in the event where that workload crashes or needs to be moved to a different node, the block storage device follows it.
What is something you wish more people knew about DOKS or Kubernetes in general?
Hmm. I think I wish more people knew how much money you can save with DOKS, and as well as how scalable it really is. And we have some really large deployments running on DOKS that have been growing like weeds and have been wildly successful. And I think that there's a perception that maybe DOKS isn't as scalable as their competition or something, but that's certainly not the case. I think we're really proud of what we built, and it's definitely a great place to deploy your services and set up your business. Um, Kubernetes in general, I think that's a tough one. I think maybe it's that you don't need to understand literally everything when it comes to Kubernetes to be able to get some value out of it. That's maybe a short and sweet answer.
Very cool. Let me look through some of the new questions that just came in here. In your view, does DOKS and Kubernetes mark the end of Terraform fever?
I don't think so, considering DOKS is available as a Terraform provider. So you can set up a DOKS cluster with Terraform if you so choose to. So we've had that functionality since kind of the beta. I think Terraform is definitely interesting. I don't think it's going anywhere, and obviously it's great that it's cross cloud, cross platform, and I definitely like that. Especially I had a background, I did a lot of cloud formation in the past, and Terraform is much easier to wrap your head around than that. So unfortunately, not unfortunately, but no, I doubt that it's the end of Terraform fever.
Thanks for that. How do I get started with Kubernetes as a beginner? Thanks for sharing all the great documentation so far, but I'm still a little bit confused as to where I should start.
Sure. So I think the first thing is to you need to get your feet wet with containers first before you worry too much about Kubernetes. So there's a bunch of different container runtimes that are available these days. Containerd, CRIO, for example. Docker obviously is the one that everyone knows. Once you're comfortable, building a container, building your application into a container, then I think at that point it's like that PDF that I shared within the slides is a great place to start, because it kind of starts you from there. It's like, okay, hey, here's how to get going with containers. Okay, now that you know how to work with containers, here's some concepts you need to understand. And kind of, I guess it's baby steps. It kind of handholds you through getting where you need to go. I think it can be difficult if you just dive right into the Kubernetes docs. It can be really overwhelming. And also, I recommend, since you can get started with DOKS for just $10 a month, launch the smallest cluster. And we have some getting started content right within the UI that will help you to get your first workload deployed. And once you have it running, it actually is a web page that shows you the manifest, the Kubernetes YAML that was used to deploy it, and explains, here's how a load balancer was defined, here's how a block storage device was defined, here's some of the various settings. And you can take that and fork it. It's available on GitHub. Make some modifications to it and just sort of tweak it until you have a little better understanding of what's going on.
Great. From the slides, the node showed that a 4 GB node only had 2.5 GB usable. Is there a reason why the usable memory is so low in comparison to just using a droplet?
Interesting. I'm trying to remember what the exact available resources are for all of our various node types. So I'm not. We may have made an update to be more realistic about the usable space, because yes, there is some overhead that comes with running Kubernetes in general. So we have an agent that we're running to make it so the DOKS functions properly. But also, the various components that make up Kubernetes take some resources. So it's not a ton, but on a much smaller node, it can be fairly substantial. So 400 megabytes, 500 megabytes. So if you're using a node that only has a couple of gigabytes, then you're not gonna be able to fit a whole lot on there. And that's one of the reasons why we actually don't offer the smallest droplet type as an option. And we do recommend using a larger node. So the cheapest that you can get started with is a single worker node for $10 a month. And even then, you're limited in terms of number of things you can fit on it. It's great for learning. If you just want to, deploy some, some dummy workloads or play with the API or kind of learn concepts, it's perfectly sufficient. But we definitely recommend, a slightly larger node if you're going to be running anything in production.
Great. How married are we to DigitalOcean's ecosystem when we use DOKS? Let's say we want to migrate to another cloud provider after we started using DOKS. How difficult or how easy would that be?
It's really, you're not married at all, so it would be quite easy. I mean, there's various things you have to consider when you're doing a migration. But we're not doing anything that's DO specific. There's nothing proprietary about DOKS. We conform to CNCF standards, and we make sure that every version that we release to you as a user conforms to CNCF standards. So I can't remember what the tool is now. It used to be called it was Arc by HepDO, which helped you to back up your workloads. It has a new name post their acquisition. But you can just as easily dump your workloads using kube control and import them into a cluster on a different provider, and everything should work just fine. The one thing to consider is the actual data that's stored on your block storage devices. We don't have a migration path per se for that. There's nothing stopping you from connecting to your cluster and syncing that data out. But we don't have an automated way to do that. But I don't believe that any clouds really do at the moment. So it's just a hurdle. If you're only running stateless things, then really easy to move.
Got it. Would we have to change anything in our code to do the port?
Nope, not at all. So all the different providers out there have what's called a CCM, a cloud controller manager, which abstracts away the differences between the providers. So our CCM is where we support various things, but one that comes to mind is load balancers. And that's what enables you to specify a service of type load balancer, the same way you would specify a service of type load balancer on AWS and end up with an ELB. So it should require no changes, unless you within your code unless you tied yourself to DO within your code. But if you're following kind of like 12-factor app best practices, where you're using environment variables and the like, then there should be no issue.
What would the high level differences be between setting up a PostgreSQL DBaaS versus running your own PostgreSQL on DOKS?
Sure. So our DBaaS product is really full featured. So you're getting logs within the UI, connection profiles about what's allowed to connect or not, connection pools, so setting those up, multi-node high availability, automatic upgrades, really easy scaling. So it's possible to run stateful workloads on DOKS. The thing that you need to be aware of is that in the case of, like I mentioned, upgrades, for example, if you're running you could definitely use up persistent volume and run Postgres on your cluster. But running it in an HA scenario would be much more challenging, mostly because our block storage doesn't support what's called read-write many, which is, you can think of as almost like a network file system where multiple different nodes can connect to the same block storage device. So the data story gets more complicated. As you're doing an upgrade, you're taking nodes down, bringing them back up. Postgres is getting moved to a different node. There's just more. It could work, but there's just more failure scenarios involved with it. And we think that DBaaS works well and is basically takes all that headache away from you. So it's really your choice, but I think there's some availability things that you'd want to consider before doing that.
Got it. Do you have any plans for RWX volume support? Right now it's only RWO.
That's another company-wide question that we're considering. So definitely something that we're people are asking for, but nothing to announce today.
Thanks. I think that's all the questions that we have. I'm going to give maybe 30 more seconds for folks to type in questions if they have any last minute ones. All right, a few more have just come in. Okay. Is there a way to target a node pool for deployments or pods to run on?
Yeah, definitely. So labels are what you're going to want to use there. And so one thing I should have mentioned that I didn't was when you add tags within the UI. So if I add a tag to my node pool, for example, it automatically gets converted and becomes a Kubernetes label. And then when I'm deploying my workload and my manifest, I can basically target that label for where I want that to be deployed to. So that's a really great way to, if I have, like I mentioned, if you want to use your node pools for specific workloads, that's how you do it.
Does DOKS support node taints?
Yeah, I mean, you can set taints and tolerances. You're just going to use kube control to do it. So there's nothing like directly built into the UI or built into the CLI to do that, but yeah, it does.
If I wanted to run 10 nodes and have them all serve the same domain, do I have to pay for a load balancer, or does the Kubernetes distribute the traffic between the nodes? I'm new to Kubernetes.
Yeah, in that case, you would want to use a load balancer. It would be possible you could run like an ingress, like Nginx or HA proxy or something on the nodes, and then set that up and set up all the node IP addresses in DNS. That's not ideal at all, though, because obviously the node IP addresses aren't stable. As we replace them, you get new IPs. So we definitely recommend using a load balancer. That's going to be the most sane way to do it and give you the best outcome for sure.
Is there a way to remove the jobs that ran using Kubernetes that still remain after completion?
Yeah, so typically, if you're running a workload of type job, there's a few different, usually that's going to be a scheduled job or like a cron job. That might be the case that your job that you're running isn't exiting on completion. It should just not be there once it exits. But you could just as easily use kube control to delete that.
Got it. What's the implication of the event when a master goes down? Is my cluster still accessible, or is there a downtime until the master comes back online?
Sure, yeah. So if the master goes down, your workloads and services will still all be online. So it doesn't have any impact on what's running. What is true is that until it comes back, you won't be able to make changes or make new deployments. So the Kubernetes API would be unavailable But when it comes back, like I mentioned, all of the etcd data and all of the configuration for the master is stored on a block storage device. So, it takes maybe 55 seconds for a new master to come online. At that point, it's almost like it's the same one. Everything goes back to working. So there's no downtime to your end users.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Phil, for the presentation and for taking the time to answer so many questions. Do
Absolutely.
you have any last words of wisdom for everyone who's joining us on the call today?
Sure, yeah. Well, firstly, I want to thank everybody for coming today and listening. I really appreciate it. And I guess my words of wisdom would be to definitely don't be afraid to dive in and give Kubernetes a try. I think that DOKS is a wonderful way to get your feet wet and start to learn. And we're definitely making every effort to make that as easy as possible for you. And also just keep in mind that while it is a great place to come and learn and educate yourself, it's also a wonderful place to scale out and to support your growth as a company and as a service. So yeah, we really hope you give it a try, and we really appreciate all your feedback. It's what drives our roadmap and what keeps us motivated to keep delivering great products for you. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks everyone for joining. Let us know what you'd like to learn about next. Happy coding.